Just finished up a day here at our 6-acre site, doing some cleanup work, some raking, some brush movement, cleaning up an old shiitake mushroom yard. And I'm realizing we're at a good moment to do some inspection or some observation on water systems, how they're holding, how overflow states are moving. We're right above freezing today. We had some rain this morning. Things are thawing out and water's starting to move. You can see the main pond here still has a nice crust of ice, but on the surface it's thawing. We'll take a look at that in a little while to check in on the leaky berm. How's it holding? The spoiler alert is it seems like it's holding for now, but we'll look at that in more detail. But what I thought I'd like to do first is go up to the far west end of the property, which is where the watershed enters from another landscape and starts to move through this landscape. I want to see how the overflows are working and how it's all being held, so stick around. One of the ways that this pond is filled, this is probably one of the more substantial channels that slowly filters in and feeds it, is this overflow ditch through here. You can see it has debris in it to filter as it goes. I've dug this out a little bit more recently. Goes through a nice little meander. If I can find it, there's an old video where I talked about making this turn in here. So this is a continual slow draining from the far end of the property. You can see that's happening there. But one of the main things I look for as I'm observing these waterways when they thaw is to hopefully not see a lot of cloudiness in the water. That's one of the things it's telling me. If I do see it, I've got issues with overflow or speed of water. There's not enough filtering and sediment catch happening. By and large, these little systems all through here are doing their work. You can see, imagine it's like a digestive system. There's, the stomach and then passageways and then the large intestine. I don't know if that's actually the right example, although these do look like organs. But each time we have a bigger space and then an overflow, each one of these act as really great, simple silt catches that we can harvest from later. And the clearer the water runs through them, the less we have to dig them out in the future. That means the overall system is starting to function really nicely. There's enough silt catches upslope that none of these are getting silted in. Moved upslope a little bit from that whole area where I was just walking, which fed into the pond, and I realized I was supposed to go at the beginning of this whole watershed for this wander. I get distracted. There's so many little areas to look at and think about, so now I'm just gonna trek all the way up there. I can see some little flow patches in here, way less total water flow. This runs pretty thoroughly when there's lots of rain happening, so it's nice to see that that's mellowed and relaxed. These little pocket ponds, little micro ponds, they just fill up from water pressure from below, and those are nice and full. This is one of our irrigation ponds here that we'll take a look at in a bit. That seems like it's at capacity and draining to the north. But let's go up to where water enters in from our neighbor spot. So that is, again, the far west end of this property. You might be familiar with this layout if you've watched enough videos, but basically this is due west. It is a conventional orchard over there. So one of my major questions / concerns is, okay, water's probably coming in from that landscape in this moment, but is it flowing through the diversion ditches that I want? And that question will be answered when we get to the entrance point. You can see how intense the deer traffic is through here. It's amazing. It's like a highway. So in their field, you can kind of see through there are some wet spots. And as that comes down, so that's higher elevation than here, it starts to wick in somewhere right around here. And it used to run directly over this walkway and into some of our ponds over there. And so we've since diverted it. This is the diversion channel, which is full and is probably flowing northbound. That's my hope. Again, it's not silty. It is moving barely. So subtle. Well, that's fine though. It's nice to know there's water in there, and if it gets a bunch more rain out of nowhere, it can freely continue to head north through this channel. This goes all the way down the property and then goes back into their orchard on that far end. It's interesting to see how thoroughly the brush wall works, except for where it doesn't. So this is a place that the deer identified as a weak point, and they push their way through and then use their bodies to really reinforce that aperture. And boy, oh boy, can they just get right through there. So we have posts along this side. We're going to add them in and run some wire later on. But for now, we're happy to have them move through. Yeah, the water's moving the way it ought to. It's going to the north, which is what I want, and I'm not seeing any spots where it's overflowing and coming directly into our main watershed unfiltered. And so as long as it keeps going gently to the north, doesn't have to be rushing, slow and steady is really, really good by me. It can get to that far corner, and then we have a dugout over there that sends it back into the woods a little further north and west of here, which keeps most of any liberated free chemicals that might be in the water going back into a woodland context that isn't ours. What's an interesting phenomenon is the water that's going in there, instead of rushing right over and directly into our landscape, going across contour, or pretty much on contour but slightly pitched to the north, the overall water table underneath all this soil, so basically that's applying water pressure, I think, to the ground down below. And so then wherever we have these small dugout ponds, they're filling from the bottom up. So they're really clean, they're really cold this time of year, and we've got these cool little reserves of water. So this is a production space that we have in pawpaws here. This was a cover crop. We had tulsi over here. And so in the early spring, now that we've got this, we can pull water with a solar panel and a pump into a container or another container or a tank and have water to get these beds established. This will be bone dry by July or August, almost certainly. But being filled with water pressure from below and available in the early spring when we need the most water for establishment, they're super helpful. We can see more of that theme of these little long, shallow filtering ponds that are allowing water to move through the landscape and fill larger ponds. So this was one we hand dug a couple of years ago, I think in 2020, and that is at absolute capacity, just about. Maybe it could go another few inches higher, but not much. And so in the spring, we'll fill that cylindrical 700-gallon tank, first order business, get this tank set up next to it and fill that, and then have the overflow go and fill IBC tanks down slope so that we can capture as much excess water from here and store it up high with gravity feed potential. So basically charge our storage batteries in the spring. Right now it's too early to do that because we may still get very, very cold weather that would be tough on that plastic. So the water stays in the hole for now and gets lifted later. It really is the land of 1,000 micro ponds. Everywhere I go, I'm seeing a little water reflecting back, which is sweet. This used to be pretty much dead flat. All of this has been texturized over the years as a response to how extremely uniformly wet and unproductive the landscape was during fall, winter, and spring, and how bone dry and harsh the soil was in the summer when it dried out. So by having all of this texture, this lumpiness, the water can be stored and accessed. Overflow can happen in meaningful and thoughtful ways, and then the garden beds can just get extremely deep and loose and completely filled with organic matter. And so we have all of these contexts that are right next to each other over and over and over again, and it's proven to be really wonderfully productive landscape as a result. This is one channel set that I dug out a bunch of years ago. Runs very clean these days, which is nice to see. Probably try to get some duckweed in there in the spring, since that one holds, that stays with water a bit longer than the other ones. I thought I would wander over to where the hand dug pond is that Juan and I did a few years ago and see how that is functioning. These are some hand dug ponds and a machine dug pond there, doing their thing, looking pretty nice. And we'll get into there and renovate the edges this spring and think about a good planting system for semi-aquatic plants in there. But for now, I wanted to see how the hand dug pond is. Beautiful. It is nice and full. That miscanthus island still doing its thing. Persimmon Island over here. So this pond is probably at just about capacity. Again, probably could go up another, I don't know, 3 inches, 4 inches or so before it starts overflowing. But that's a lot of nice surface area covered in water. It's not very deep in here, but none of the ponds are. But this will be an amazing place to pull water from in the spring, again, to charge our batteries in the landscape to service production areas later on during the summer. It's sweet to see this space kind of coming into its own. The miscanthus really has a lot of effect on the feel in here between all the debris, all the chaff of the miscanthus stalks, and all the ones in the background there. It really is a grassland sort of vibe in here, which I like a lot, and it's only going to increase because miscanthus tends to only steadily increase. So that look and this sound of the grasses will probably be a really beautiful part of this whole area deep into the future. There's some distinct sections of the property that don't have any ponds. Here we've got some old apples, some young bamboo groves. There's some Jerusalem artichoke patches and autumn olive patches. And in here, there's no explicit pond systems to speak of. This area is naturally a little bit of a rise or a minor ridge in the landscape. You can see it is a bump. So we don't have any ponds in here, but a big pond there, and then this whole minor valley. That's what we were walking through most of this. This is all the drainage basin for the landscape. So subtle, but even the most flat seeming landscapes definitely have some undulation and have water moving through them. And I think it's important to share. I think for most folks who watch this channel, you'd know this already. None of this was pre-planned on paper. None of it was measured with lasers and all that. This is really everything we're looking at together is the process of slowly making adjustments over the years. After a really big rain coming out and getting water to redirect and dealing with silt that's moving, adding more complexity and silt traps in between little ponds, refining things, getting planting done. So this is probably 13 years now of slow iterative design, and it's really coming together in a nice way. I'm heading north and west from that main drainage valley that our largest pond is in that I was just looking at, and back up a ridge just a tiny bit. You can maybe sense it as you're watching this video. You can feel that I'm moving up slope, possibly. I can barely tell, but it's true. And then it crests and it goes back into a minor valley right in here. And I wanted to take a look. I'm quite sure that water will be moving through there right now. That's what allows a release of excess water from the top end of the landscape. And it's certainly running at a nice little clip. You can see I cut that out. I renovated that recently, and it's running nice and clean and freely, which it needs to, because we don't want the whole landscape, this whole west end, to be completely waterlogged. And I apologize, I realize I'm kind of bopping back and forth in all these different watersheds, but there's going to be some familiar characters and layout as I go. If it doesn't make sense, my apologies, but you can kind of see these different landmarks as we go. I was just looking at a little ways back that irrigation pond over there with that tank. So, but yeah, this is where our main drainage system happens. You can see we've thrown logs in there periodically. That acts as a really nice silt trap. If we get a flash rain out of nowhere, this is the most aggressive channel that we have. So we want physical interruptions to capture lots of excess soil, if that's what happens, and then little logs and debris throughout. But by and large, we need the water to move, and it is. Here it's heading north and east, which is the overall slope of this entire landscape. Good and clean, but with a good, healthy, small silt trap right there in case it's running with material in it. Another silt trap here, crossing a walkway. And then to deal with extreme rain events, this is like a an emergency, on highways where you're going down slope, they have those ramps for runaway trucks that they can go up a ramp. If they lose their brakes, they can go up a ramp, and that slows them down before the highway continues. That's what this is. It allows the water coming down through the slope to rush up into here if it needs to, and once that's full, it can then go back down this way. And you can see that helps a lot from the rushing water from before. We get a lot of silt in this area, and we can send it onto these hugel mounds right nearby. Speaking of hugel mounds, there's so many out here that are really right on the edge of being plantable. All this moss that's starting to grow from soil thrown on here in years past. I have a tendency of making these mounds just too woody with not enough soil on top, but it's pretty satisfying to walk on them and feel them getting very close to being soil. So I think probably not this season, but 2024, 2025, this will be a full production bed all the way down the line, all the way over through there. And we're going to get the soil we need by addressing some of these poor drainage, sluggish, overly wet contexts and digging them out, making little ponds and getting soil where we need it. I'm going to meander down the last of this watershed, that drainage ditch we were looking at a little ways ago that had a couple little silt traps. Continues on. That was heading northeast for a little while, and now we're basically heading east, downslope, downslope, downslope. Basically, this channel is the vent that allows that excess water in the landscape to run its course. We've got it at a nice clip, and it's meandering through, planted out to hazelnuts to the north and Japanese walnuts all throughout there. There's a ton of elderberries and currants, some autumn olives, and sea buckthorn that all can appreciate that level of wetness. And it's letting it happen. Lots of debris. Maybe at some point, if we get a pulse rain, I'll realize I need to come through and clear some of this drainage channel. That'll be a question whether or not it overflows and floods these walkways or floods these gardens. But for the most part, it's meandering through, and the more I can tolerate debris in the channel, slowing down the water, but as long as it moves, the better the filtration will be and the more silt will get held higher up in the landscape. This just keeps on going, heading east to the north of our barn in a good assertive way right through there, and then finally down out to one last pond and to the road. A little bit more formalized in this area. Since we have infrastructure and we're going to be frequenting this, the channel becomes a little bit more deep and assertive and cleared out, because we don't want standing water right next to all this infrastructure and garden space. And here it moves at a good clip. This is about as fast as I'd ever really want drainage to happen in the property. And if I stir it up, if I break through the ice down there, I can get it cloudy, but by and large it seems like it's getting itself naturally back to a good clean run through here, ice cold and fresh. We're really in the home stretch as water moves through this landscape. This is our northernmost watershed overflow release, and when this is running, we tend to be at a place of oversaturation in the soil anyway. Someday I might try to see if we can have a little ram pump move this to other places, including this new open glade that we talked about recently. But by and large, the water needs to get out of the land once it's here, because we are just too wet at that point. But here it settles out, it goes into a delta vibe, deposits any nutrient that it might have, fills those areas, and then will fill this pond. Right now, though, this pond is not filling up. I think there's a leak in our filter here, and it's going down to the road, but I'm fine with that. Super long tour of all these different nooks and crannies of water moving through our 6-acre spot, hopefully with words of encouragement embedded in that to think about with a shovel and some direct interaction with water as it's moving. How can you improve the water holding capacity in your landscape, the silt reduction in water leaving your landscape, and just have more complex context throughout your landscape of wet areas adjacent to drier areas. You can see in here it's pretty nicely drained and now open for a lot of sun and more production. And all this complex water running around to the north of us, we can dip into in the spring in creative ways. So that's pretty helpful to us. Anyway, let me know what sort of questions you have or comments and what you're doing with water stuff where you live. Thanks for watching.